A decade of blood, the rise and reckoning of Mexico's war on drugs. On a sultry summer evening in 2006, the Sol y Sombra nightclub in Uruapan, Michoacan, became the stage for an unspeakable spectacle. Amid the pulsating rhythm of music and the chatter of revelers, a terrifying interruption brought the revelry to a halt. Members of La Familia Michoacana, one of Mexico's most brutal drug cartels, tossed 5 severed heads onto the dance floor. Alongside this grotesque display, they left a chilling note, a declaration of divine justice and their strategy for targeted killings. This act of terror was not just a gruesome headline, it became the catalyst for a seismic shift in Mexican politics and society. The nation was weeks away from its 2006 presidential election, and the incident ignited a firestorm of debate about national security. Into this maelstrom stepped Felipe Calderon, a presidential candidate who seized the moment with a bold promise to rid the nation of the cartel menace. Calderon's pledge would soon plunge Mexico into a war that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, redefine the nation's identity, and leave behind a legacy of questions with few satisfying answers. A campaign of clean hands, Felipe Calderon was poised to become only the second Mexican president in modern history from outside the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, PRI, the political behemoth that had dominated the 20th century. His campaign painted him as a beacon of integrity against the PRI's corrupt past, encapsulated in his slogan, "My hands are clean." But Calderon's ascent to the presidency was fraught with controversy. His opponent, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, claimed electoral fraud and refused to concede defeat, branding Calderon an illegitimate president. Against this backdrop of political turbulence, Calderon found an enemy that could unify a fractured nation: the drug cartels. The war begins, Operation Michoacan. On December 11, 2006, barely 2 weeks into his presidency, Calderon made his first decisive move. He launched Operation Michoacan, deploying over 6,500 soldiers, Marines, and federal police to wrest control of the state from organized crime. His rhetoric was resolute. Mexico was a country under siege, and the government would reclaim it. Calderon asked for patience, warning that the fight would be long and arduous. Few could have foreseen just how protracted and devastating this war would become. A decade of violence. In the years that followed, the toll of Calderon's war was staggering. By 2016, 150,000 people had been killed. 30,000 more were missing. Countless others were displaced or traumatized by the pervasive violence. Some of these atrocities became global headlines. Students disappeared in Ayotzinapa in 2014, their fate still unknown. 22 civilians executed by the army in Tlatlaya. These numbers surpass the civilian death tolls in Iraq and Afghanistan during the same period. Despite the bloodshed, the cartels remain entrenched. Drugs continue flowing northward into the United States, the world's largest consumer of cocaine. The very war that sought to disrupt the supply chain instead fueled violence and fear, leaving Mexico's streets littered with the debris of a conflict that feels unwinnable. The cost of a transnational war. The roots of Mexico's drug war stretch back to the 1970s, when U.S. President Richard Nixon declared drugs public enemy number one. The so-called war on drugs has since consumed billions of dollars, embroiled multiple nations, and turned Mexico into a battlefield. The U.S. government, while condemning the violence, has been complicit. American demand for drugs drives the trade, while U.S.-made weapons fuel cartel arsenals. From 2006 to 2016, the U.S. provided Mexico with $1.5 billion in aid through the Merida Initiative, funding aircraft, training, and equipment. But critics argue this militarized approach only perpetuates the cycle of violence. The political theater of war analysts like Ruben Aguilar and Jorge Castañeda suggest that Calderon's drug war wasn't just about crime, it was about legitimacy. Facing widespread doubt about his presidency, Calderon needed a unifying cause. The cartels became a convenient enemy, and Calderon's slogan, "Para que la droga no llegue a tus hijos," keep drugs out of your children's reach, became his rallying cry. But this justification was thin. Data from the Mexican National Council on Addictions and the United Nations showed that drug use in Mexico was low and remained so. Mexico wasn't a nation of users, it was a transit country, a pipeline for drugs bound for the US. The military and the rule of law, Calderon turned to the military to combat cartels, knowing that Mexico's police were too corrupt and inefficient to handle the task. Yet this decision sparked controversy. The Mexican Constitution, under Article 129, restricts the military's involvement in law enforcement during peacetime. Precedents set by previous administrations allowed Calderon to bypass these limitations. By 2016, his successor Enrique Peña Nieto had quietly continued the same strategy, even as human rights violations by the military skyrocketed. What lies ahead? A decade after Calderon's war began, Mexico stands at a crossroads. The drug war has failed to curb trafficking or dismantle cartels, and the violence shows no signs of abating. Experts argue that the solution lies not in more war, but in decriminalization and demilitarization. The Global Commission on Drug Policy recommends treating drug use as a health issue rather than a criminal one, regulating markets like Uruguay has done with marijuana. General Salvador Cienfuegos Zepeda, Mexico's defense minister, has openly criticized the war, stating, "None of us studied to chase criminals." Even the military, it seems, is weary of its role. A tragic legacy, a chance for change. In 1996, U.S. drug czar Barry McCaffrey declared that a war against an intangible enemy like drugs could never truly be won. Nearly 3 decades later, his words echo with painful clarity in Mexico, where the fight against cartels has not only failed, but also deepened the country's wounds. The drug war has turned Mexico's towns into battlegrounds and its citizens into collateral damage. Each severed head, each missing person, each mass grave tells a story of a country struggling to reclaim its humanity. Yet amid this tragedy lies an opportunity, a chance to break free from the cycles of violence and reimagine Mexico's future, choosing a new path. Lessons from the world. Across the globe, countries are beginning to question the old paradigms of the war on drugs. Portugal, for example, took a bold step in 2001 by decriminalizing all drugs. Instead of imprisoning users, the government redirected resources toward rehabilitation and education. The result? Drug use did not skyrocket, as many had feared. Instead, addiction rates fell and drug-related deaths plummeted. Uruguay has similarly pioneered a regulated market for marijuana, ensuring that production and distribution are controlled, taxed, and safe. These reforms haven't eliminated all drug-related problems, but they've proven one thing. Treating drugs as a public health issue, rather than a criminal one, can lead to tangible progress. Mexico, too, can take inspiration from these models. Decriminalizing personal use, regulating drug markets, and providing support to those battling addiction could weaken cartels by disrupting their revenue streams. Instead of pouring billions into military operations that fuel corruption and violence, Mexico could invest in education, healthcare, and community development, areas that strengthen society from the ground up. Demilitarizing Mexico, a return to civilian rule, a critical step in this transformation is demilitarization. Since the start of the drug war, Mexico's military has taken on roles it was never meant to fulfill, eroding public trust and contributing to widespread human rights violations. General Salvador Cienfuegos Zepeda, Mexico's defense minister, admitted in 2016 that the war had denaturalized the military, turning soldiers into law enforcement agents ill-equipped for the task. Restoring the rule of law requires empowering Mexico's civilian police force. But this isn't as simple as retraining officers. It demands rooting out systemic corruption, increasing accountability, and building relationships between communities and law enforcement. The transition won't be easy, but it's essential for Mexico to reclaim its democratic identity, a joint responsibility. The US-Mexico connection. Mexico cannot achieve lasting change alone. The drug trade is inherently transnational, driven by demand in the United States and financed by American dollars. The US has a moral and practical obligation to support Mexico in shifting its approach, not through militarized aid, but by addressing its own drug policies. Recent trends in the US suggest this is possible. States like California, Colorado, and Oregon have legalized recreational marijuana, while others are exploring harm reduction strategies for harder substances. Federal policy, however, lags behind. For meaningful change, the US must decriminalize drug use nationwide, invest in treatment programs, and crack down on the flow of weapons and drug money south of the border. Collaboration between the two nations could redefine their relationship, not as adversaries in a failing war, but as partners in building safer, healthier societies. The price of inaction, the cost of maintaining the status quo, is immense. Already, over 150,000 lives have been lost in the drug war, with 30,000 more missing and countless families shattered. Entire communities live in fear, their streets patrolled by cartels and soldiers alike. Without change, this violence will only escalate. The cartels will adapt, finding new ways to profit and corrupt. Generations of Mexicans will grow up in a world where safety is a distant memory and justice is an unattainable dream. A smarter beginning, Mexico is at a crossroads. It can continue to fight a war that has already been lost, sacrificing more lives in a futile battle, or it can chart a new course, one rooted in evidence, empathy, and the hard-earned lessons of the past. Ending the drug war is not just a policy decision, it's a moral imperative. It requires courage from leaders willing to challenge entrenched interests and honesty from citizens ready to confront uncomfortable truths. Above all, it demands a vision of Mexico as a nation where security is not synonymous with violence and where liberty is not traded for fleeting stability. This decade of tragedy need not define Mexico's future. With the right choices, it can mark the beginning of a smarter, more humane chapter. For the sake of those who have perished and those who remain, Mexico must seize this chance to rebuild. Comment and subscribe if you like this story.